Tonight, we're delighted to welcome former/future, it's not quite clear, visiting fellow and journalist Matthieu Aikins to discuss his new book, The Naked Don't Fear the Water. And we're especially excited because Matthieu just won a National Magazine Award for his reporting on the fall of Kabul. So doubly hot presence this evening. So we're just going to launch straight in. These conversations tend to go very, very quickly. You cite many reasons, Matthieu, that you decided to accompany your friend, translator, driver, Omar, on the refugee underground road to write about it, to help him. You said that you would pay for everything. And for yourself to restart your life, to move on from Afghanistan after 7 years of war reporting. This is obviously before the fall of Kabul. Why did you join Omar on the road, and how did you negotiate these shifting and often in conflict reasons for joining him?
Well, Omar, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here finally after I was supposed to come here in 2020, and well, a few things got in the way. And anyhow, Omar was one of my oldest friends in Afghanistan. I met him shortly after I moved there. Went there in 2008 at the age of 24. We worked together. We became good friends. I got to know his family. He was someone who had grown up in exile in Iran and Turkey, Iran and Pakistan, sorry. And his mother had actually been pregnant with him when she fled the Soviets and as a refugee, like millions of other Afghans. But they returned after 2001, full of hope for this new era of peace and development that was promised by the West. Gradually, as conditions deteriorated, Omar decided to leave. He had long hoped to get one of these special immigrant visas that the US government was giving to Iraqi and Afghan employees, but he was denied because he didn't have the paperwork, though he should have qualified based on his service with the American military. So he decided to go with smugglers, and this is in 2015, at the moment of the European migration crisis, when over the span of about a year, around 1 million people crossed through the Mediterranean into Europe.
Yeah.
And the second nationality among that was Afghan. So anyhow, I was interested in the crisis. It was a huge news story, so I was curious about reporting on it. I also cared a lot about Omar. I decided to go with him. I think in the beginning, I had more of a sense that I was going to be able to do this as an observer, as a journalist, and somehow bracket out the fact that this was such a personal journey as well, to travel with him. But gradually, as I described in the book, those other more personal motivations began to take the foreground, and I felt quite conflicted about whether I was really an observer or participant, and was pushed by some extreme situations to have to take some measures that really got me out of my role as a journalist. So it's sort of a conflict that you can see throughout the book.
Right. And up until this point, you cited Robert Graves, and you mentioned that you had turned off or switched off something called the emotion recording apparatus.
That's Graves' words from, Goodbye to All That, where he's talking about his experience during the First World War.
You felt like your emotion recording apparatus was firmly off when you went on this trip?
I mean, at the time I'd been working for 7 years in Afghanistan and Syria and Yemen and Iraq. I'd been through a lot of, difficult situations in the course of reporting. The reason I brought that up there is kind of one of the first crises that we reached together when we're trying to cross through the desert at the Iranian border, and then it turns out the smuggler was lying to us, and we had this argument in the safe house. And I guess I was trying to explain why, for me, I was willing to continue onward. Omar wanted to turn back, and I was sort of pushing him. I realized later, pushing him into this journey, which I did think we should have taken because we'd run so much risk just to get to that point. But he decided to turn back, and at the end, I went back with him. But reflecting a bit on my actions, why he was like, "Don't risk your life, brother, it's not worth it." And I had much of a less of a good reason than he did to risk it.
I want to just stay on the reasons that you wrote this book, and just kind of push you on the first reason, which is to write about it. You know, you're a young, ambitious journalist. You, as you say, you arrived in Afghanistan. You're 24 years old. You have many, you know, you report on many fantastic stories. They're reported in Rolling Stone, in the New York Times magazine. And by writing about it, you inscribe in a tradition of writers who have gone underground over the years. So we can think of, and you yourself cite some of them. So I think gesturing to the inscription in this transition. We can think of George Orwell, who traveled to the mines and slums of the industrial north in the 1930s in the road to Wigan Pier. We can think of Jack London, who set out in 1903 to the slums of London to find, and I quote, a new and different race of people short of stature and of wretched or beer-sodden appearance. And he writes about this experience. And Matthieu does not write about refugees like that in his book, but he writes about this experience and the people of the abyss. And you note of the people of the abyss, the book you write was an immediate bestseller. So here we find ourselves, Matthieu, you've just won this big prize. We're in the 7th arrondissement of Paris. Your book has been translated into Spanish, Polish, Czech, German. It's been well reviewed. Just cynically, because I have to ask, do you feel at all that you were profiteering off an experience that was not yours?
Well, profiteering is such a strong word. You know, profiting, in a sense, yes. You know, profiteering means that you're exploiting, I think, right? And you know, there is something kind of ugly about what we do as journalists, as foreign correspondents. We go to situations where people are, you know, undergoing a lot of suffering, and we take their stories back to a pretty comfortable audience and sell them for money to make our living. Now, frankly, if I wanted profiteer in Afghanistan, I would have worked for, you know, USAID or one of these military contractors, and I'd have an apartment in the 7th arrondissement probably, you know. So I think it's fair to say that we're not getting rich off this. Trying to make a living. We're trying to be fair to the people that we cover. At the same time, I don't think there's a way out of some of these structural dilemmas, and I wanted to be conscious of that. I want to talk about the tradition, which is not just Orwell or Jack London. It's Richard Burton, you know, an imperialist traveler who passed actually as an Afghan, famously, to penetrate the holy city of Mecca, you know, and he so I think you have to be conscious of this without thinking that you can necessarily solve these dilemmas. Or
yeah, and I think you are in the book, and you quote Omar early on saying of Afghanistan, "There's no future for me here." And he says to you, "You have a good job, you have documents, you can travel anywhere you want." Omar looked at his city. "The only thing I have is my luck." Over the course of this journey, Matthieu, did you ever feel that this distance between you and Omar and some of his fellow refugees collapsed? So you write, "There was a gulf between us, but I thought we could bridge it in our encounter as humans."
Yeah, I mean, that moment when I thought, I'm writing of myself as a naive 24-year-old, you know, wanting to meet fellow humans, arriving in Uzbekistan, Afghanistan. Of course, you are both humans and you can have a real connection, but that doesn't mean that these hierarchies are suddenly erased. And I think that you know, there's a point in the book where I address this fairly explicitly. It's after we've made the water crossing to Lesbos, and I'm lying in the camp thinking about this journey and the way that, of course, the people I made this journey with on this boat, they thought I was a refugee too. You know, it really was a completely undercover journey. Only Omar knew my secret. So they would often greet you as, you know, you had a warmth having survived this crossing together. But I also felt a kind of, I guess, I felt like I didn't fully understand or couldn't know what it was to have been in their shoes, to have never seen the ocean before, and then suddenly have to embark on this boat, you know, I chose to be there, right? So you feel almost sometimes a little bit of, it's a bit of an anguished realization that there is no real possibility of closing that gap, that even, and certainly not by doing some act of daring do and traveling the same boat, is that going to put you in complete solidarity with them. There's maybe other ways, better ways that I get to in the fourth part, when there's this political project of activists at City Plaza. So again, it's sort of showing the contradictions without necessarily being able to resolve them.
And yet, you one way that you, as you say, kind of bridge the gap is by really eschewing or kind of dropping your identity as Matthieu to join Omar, and you disguised yourself as a young Kabuli from a modest background, claiming that you were 26 instead of 31, and luckily, as you mentioned early on, you already look Afghani, and this is something that you realize very early on. You arrive in Afghanistan, people kind of welcome you and often mistake you as Afghani. And so I wanted you to kind of read to everyone here the series of refrains that you were practicing before you set out on the journey. So we'll just get that.
Sure. Well, so in preparation for this journey, I had to kind of create an alter ego, and I was practicing this in both Persian and a really fake English accent that I will not imitate here, but that I had to, if I couldn't be in the refugee camp and you're talking to some aid worker in my normal accent, so I had this very garbled attempt at an Afghan accent that was so bad that Omar himself would kind of crack up hearing me talk in English to these aid workers, and then make his own, because he speaks quite good at English, make his own accent worse. And then I'd crack up and be like, stop it, this is serious. But anyhow, so this is my story. My name is Habib. I'm from Kabul, from Shari now. Well, if you know Kabul, I'm from Khalifatullah. I live there with my mother, brothers, and sister in a rental house. The rent, 6,000 Afghanis a month. I was working in a restaurant in Haji Yaqub Square, but we didn't have a good situation. Like any other refugee, I left my country and came by the smuggler's road.
Thank you. I wanted to just quote Jack London here, because he also talks about his transformation. He writes, "Presto, in the twinkling of an eye, so to say, I had become one of them. My frayed and out at elbows jacket was the badge and the advertisement of my class, which was their class." Was it so simple for you as presto in the twinkling of the eye, I am Habib? And apart from the kind of physical transformation, what did you feel were the most kind of insidious or kind of internal parts of yourself that you had to constantly work to leave behind as you set out on this journey of Matthieu, the Westerner, the journalist?
I don't know if I had to leave them behind. I just had to disassemble them. And I think one of the things that made it easier was that, first of all, when you're on the migrant trail, when you find yourself in a smuggler's den or a refugee camp, a lot of people are hiding different things, and they have stories they're not being completely clear about. So people don't really press you, even if they may not think your story is entirely kosher. Also, Afghanistan has a lot of different dialects, a lot of different languages. There's people who've grown up in Iran and Pakistan as refugees and they've come back. So they may not speak Dari, like a native Kabuli. And I think, at the end, I did have a kind of story, a second story to tell. I was going to say that I, if someone did challenge me on whether I was really growing up in Afghanistan, I was going to say that I'd grown up as a migrant in Malaysia. My father had gone to Malaysia, and so I learned some English there, and then came back, and that was only necessary once in the whole trip. And I think that's just because people don't question what seems self-evident, that you'd be a refugee if you're there in this situation.
Yeah, I think the verb dissemble is probably the right one, because I wanted to kind of quote you here. You wrote that sometimes the lens we train on others shows us ourselves. And then you also quote John Berger, So you write, there were more intangible lines drawn by self-interest, the tracks our lives ran on, the limits of our imagination. The wall is also inside each one of us.
The book, so the book is about passing, but it's not only about me passing as a refugee. It's also about Omar, for example, passing as a Lithuanian when he has to travel with a fake identity card, and the many acts of passing that migrants themselves have to do to escape border controls and pass through the frontiers. There's all sorts of examples of passing in Afghan history, Afghans passing for different kinds of ethnicities during the Civil War to avoid getting in trouble at checkpoints. Migration, as one of the anthropologists that I cite, is itself a kind of performance. And what I was interested in was the way that people are constantly reproducing their identities in an active way, but in a way that's also very much within these huge structural forces like borders, like laws, like the disparity between the rich world and the developing world.
It's a great point, and it's also it's a point that you make at the end. It's an opportunity for a new start. You have the chance to leave behind the parts of yourself that you maybe don't want to bring with you, and kind of create a new life, create a new identity. Did you feel that was kind of going on around you?
I think the dream of migration is a fresh start. Being able to change not only your circumstances but perhaps yourself. One of the interesting things I think about the moment that we did this in was that I think it is at an era is kind of ending. The era where someone could go and invent a new identity, as many people did, say, leaving Europe and coming to the New World. That's kind of coming to an end because of the increasing prevalence of biometric technologies. So, now from early on, as our fingerprints and retinas and various other, biological aspects of our identity are captured and put into government databases and used in various forms of surveillance. So to do what I did, I was very nearly and was worried about being entangled in these. Somehow my fingerprints would be discovered when I arrived in Europe. And I don't think in 10 years that this will be possible, at least not for someone from the West, because we're so known now to the state.
This is such an interesting point. Do you think it's a good thing?
It terrifies me. No, I don't think it's a good thing. I don't think this kind of, biometric surveillance is a good thing. I think it's a sinister thing.
Just to bring us back to the particular moment in which you and Omar and many others found yourselves. So this is in 2015, 2016. We all remember the refugee crisis from that time. And I want to think, Matthieu, as we spoke about the other evening, the various subtitles of your book in French, English, and American copies as a way to better understand its project. I think they're actually revelatory in some ways. So while the title of the book, The Naked Don't Fear the Water, which is a Dari proverb, and you learnt Dari while you were in Afghanistan,
yeah.
Right? Is fairly kind of self-explanatory, which is to say, when you have nothing to lose, you have nothing to fear. En gros. But the various subtitles in French, English, and American, I think, can help us understand the project, as I mentioned. So in French, this is my translation, The Modest Don't Fear the Water, An Undercover Journey. The UK subtitle is The Naked Don't Fear the Water, A Journey Through the Refugee Underground. And then the US subtitle is The Naked Don't Fear the Water, An Underground Journey with Afghan Refugees, which you said was changed right after Biden pulled out of Afghanistan.
Well, the UK subtitle is the same as the American one.
Oh, it is.
It is, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I had to check there. Well, that was actually an earlier version of the subtitle. We had Journey Through Refugee Underground, and then that got changed to An Underground Journey with Refugees. And then because they're like, no, don't put Afghan in the subtitle because that'll just put people off. And then after Afghanistan was back in the news, they're like, oh no, we need to have Afghan in there. Well, clearly we should put Ukraine in the title somewhere.
Yes.
That would have helped. But the subtitle is really, something I think you usually delegate to the marketing team.
Right.
And this title is what I really insisted on. I had actually wanted to call it I really was kind of obsessed with having a short title, so I wanted to call it The Naked, and just have the proverb on the as the epigraph, but they didn't go for that. So the proverb in Persian is in Dari. It's a very Dari word. They use a Dari kind of colloquialism. Luch as ab namitarsad is the Persian.
Can you say it again?
Luch as ab namitarsad.
So let's just pretend that the UK version is different, just for the sake of argument. Was there something, in your opinion, Matthieu, that was particular about the journey that you and Omar took? I mean, in terms of its year, location, nationality, do you feel like you were capturing the zeitgeist of the moment, or do you feel that your journey is somehow more universal, or both?
I'm sure it has elements of both, but at the time when Omar decided to escape, that was the fall of 2015, the borders were still open. You know, it was a kind of an extraordinary event. I mean, I describe it as a miracle in the book of kind of change, a violation of a fundamental law, which is one definition of a miracle, which this is the borders open, this iron system of keeping people like Afghans out of Europe had suddenly, briefly, under the weight of this movement of people, greatest movement of refugees in seen history, had opened, right? They opened this humanitarian corridor through the Balkans, and you could, if you landed in the Greek islands and made that dangerous crossing, you could then travel in relative safety, perhaps not comfort, but on ferries and buses and trains, and eventually get to Germany. A development which actually meant that by the end of it, the majority of people arriving were women and children, because the fact that, you know, these borders are so dangerous to cross is one reason why you see so many young men doing it. Anyhow, the moment so that was the moment we wanted to start out, but because of a variety of reasons, one of them, the love story, which is also
which we're going to talk about,
which we'll get to. So Omar delayed because he was worried about losing the love of his life, and by the time we finally got our act together to leave, it was, you know, the summer of 2016, and the borders had closed once again. We kind of missed our chance. And as a result, I think what we encountered on the way, you know, the difficulties, the routes that we took, the time we spent trapped in the camp, I do think is a little more typical, actually, of the situations today at these borders. And if we had actually had the good fortune, I guess, to pass swiftly through the open borders, it may have been less applicable.
I want to ask you just, you know, what it was like, in the sense that we, I mean, I don't know about anyone else, but I certainly experienced this like many people in the West, which is from afar, looking on, reading the news, you know, seeing images, hearing about it. So we think of the refugee crisis of 2015, 2016, in which 1.3 million people traveled to the European continent in search of asylum. So words, images, associations come to mind. We think of borders opening, and as you say, then closing. We think of smugglers, human traffickers. We see images of boats of asylum seekers in bright orange or bright yellow life vests, images of makeshift tents, often from a kind of bird's eye view, submerged in mud and water, and kind of in the spirit of there is nothing new under the sun. You point out this displacement of 1.3 million people was hardly the first or indeed the largest instance of displacement in the long history of the world. But, and this is what is new, it was the first time that so many had moved in the age of constant communication and images, in terms of being so kind of interconnected by way of social media and continuous news cycles. So my question to you, Matthieu, is, having traveled the trail on the ground in real time, what did the world, looking on, projecting its anxieties, projecting its stereotypes, misunderstand profoundly about the crisis, and what could only be understood about what was happening from the ground, in your opinion?
I think that the West experienced the crisis in terms of a kind of catharsis, you know, and it really was rather than any kind of revelation. And so, you know, you had this moment, which I'm sure you remember, where the body of Alan Kurdi washed up on a beach in Turkey, this little child dead on the sand, was seen around the world. And it was this moment of total shock and horror and grief. And that was one of the deciding factors in the opening the humanitarian corridor. A few days later, Merkel made the decision to allow refugees to transit onward into Germany. And so that moment of the outpouring of sympathy, I think it's interesting to then trace how it evolved and basically, curdled into an unease and then an outright distaste and fear. Part of that, of course, with the events in Paris, that the terrorist attacks here, and the assaults, sexual assaults of women in New Year's in Cologne. But so I find it fascinating just the way that like our humanitarian sympathy, the way that our feelings about the world are mediated by images on television. They go through fairly predictable cycles, and they ultimately don't really change anything. So they provide a form of catharsis about this terrible world we're living in, rather than any kind of revelation about how we might fundamentally change it.
But let's say you just ask kind of the average person, what do you think of when you think of a migrant? What do you think of when you think of a refugee? Has your lived experience allowed you to understand about this experience that other people wouldn't possibly know?
One of the things that I find tends to be typical of stories, books about refugees. They are often written by journalists or whoever from a perspective of wanting to decry the injustice and suffering that migrants are experiencing, rightly so. But I do think as a result, there's a tendency to have this kind of litany of misery of these, refugees are just suffering and telling you about their problems. And then that's kind of what they'll do. When you go to see a refugee, you stick a mic in their face in the camp and you're saying, what's wrong? They're going to tell you all these things. It's almost like a script. And
or a performance.
And a performance, yeah. I mean, but it's very true that they are experiencing injustice and suffering. But at the same time, their lives are more than that, and there's much more to the experience. And I wanted to show the people on this trip in a more human complexity, as neither just victims nor saints nor villains, but as people, with a kind of lived complexity that you would find in fiction. And one of the, I think, the upshots of doing this journey undercover as a refugee, so that people were speaking to me as a fellow refugee, was that they weren't complaining. They complain sometimes. They were boasting. They were excited. They were scared. They were trying to find ways to sneak on board trucks. They were just talking, and it is sort of a record of what that daily life is like, that I hope gives you maybe a more human understanding of the people on this trail.
Does a particular example come to mind?
I mean, I was fascinated just hanging out with the guys by the port, the kids. A lot of them were children, actually, who were trying to sneak on board these trucks. So one of the ways to get off the island or later on to get out of Greece is to, the Afghans call it the game, actually use an English word. They also call it andacht, which means sort of like trying, and they'll stalk these trucks and then try to get inside and then stow away on board the ferries. And it can be extraordinarily dangerous. I mean, they'll run while the truck is at a stop and slide underneath the, like above the axle, basically, often with a board, so they don't get caught in it. So you can imagine how dangerous that is. And we, just to spend, I liked hanging out with these guys, listening to how they talked about this journey and what they would expect to find in Europe. I think it's a perspective that it's not easy to get.
I want to talk about a kind of maybe the flip side of the false narrative, because we have our kind of false sense of narrative of what was happening on the ground, and likewise, possibly the people coming to the continent or Europe, or going on to America, they don't necessarily have a real conception of what life will actually be like when they arrive in the countries that they're trying to get to. And so in the case of your pal and dear friend Omar. This is brilliantly. I mean, if you were a novelist, you would be delighted by this. It's doubled in his relationship with, as you say, his beloved Layla. And so in the sense that he and Layla have never actually, at least in the book, I imagine now, have never actually been together. And so his kind of desire to be with her is entirely projected, and he's just imagined his whole life with her. They've exchanged phone calls, they've exchanged texts, but they've never, as you say, passed a night naked in each other's arms, for instance, or walked openly on the street. They knew each other over the phone. Perhaps he loved his idea of her. Perhaps he loved a fantasy. Could also be said, perhaps he loved this idea of, insert Western country. Perhaps he loved a fantasy. Tell us about the kind of mirage of the West and of love.
Yeah, well, I think that a dream can be a repository for so much about what we'd like to see happen in the world. I think it's the same when we first meet someone. For example, we can, our idea of them can be perhaps more beautiful than any human being could ever be, and getting to know them. Speaking of love, is a sort of a process of chipping away at that very idealized image, hopefully replaced by something more enduring. So of course, the West is a dream for him that began when he was a kid in Iran watching dubbed version of of The Road to Avonlea, which is like a Canadian TV serial about Anne of Green Gables, kind of. It's set in that universe in Prince Edward Island, very beautiful. And he swore when he grew up he'd move to Canada and marry Sarah Polley, who was the actress who played the main character. And so I think that this dream that people have, it's their own dream. And I think one of the interesting things for me was, and I guess I tried to show a little bit or hint at, because I didn't want to have a heavy hand with this, is that Omar's dream, of possessing I use that word, possessing a wife and a home, deliberately. There's an echo, and I don't even know if it's obvious, but it's sort of like Odysseus's dream of Penelope, right? Is this narrative of basically the patriarch reconstituting, the home, right, and possessing a wife and possessing his property, and that kind of dream, which is not necessarily my dream, and it's I think it's interesting because it's very often the dreams of migrants, and you saw this kind of tension in the squat where there was radical activists who were doing a great job of providing kind of fairly, a place where refugees in the maelstrom of Athens during the crisis, they were living in the squat hotel. These radicals who wanted to end capitalism were beside these migrants who just wanted to get to Germany and like get a decent job and like have a house, right? And so there's just these, there's some very interesting tensions, I think, in the dreams of people. And I think at the end of the day, the beloved can be many things, for Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who I quote in it, the beloved was a revolution. It was a dream of a more egalitarian world.
I'm really glad you brought up not only the Odyssey, but also Faiz Ahmed Faiz, because I think what we haven't really got into, and I'm really looking at the time here, is just how much you managed to fit in to your book, Matthieu. It's really remarkable. Not only do you trace your own journey with Omar, but you very deftly and subtly tell us the history of Afghanistan, under US occupation, and what's that like, the kind of heady years of the pouring in of American money and dancing to Call Me Maybe, the history, both material and intellectual, of human movement. It's also your own coming to age story as a young, ambitious journalist. You trace your own family story of immigration, Omar's family story. It's also the love story, as we mentioned, of Omar and Layla, to whom as you say, he paradoxically leaves Afghanistan to ultimately be with her. And also it's deeply intellectual in the sense that it has a kind of philosophical, anthropological, literary regard. You cite Frantz Fanon on human movement, you cite Aristotle on natural slaves, you cite Celine Dion on love, you cite, so there's a great leveling, and I think it's, and there's a great leveling, and there's a great kind of mix of many different traditions from many different centuries, and that in itself is a kind of remarkable feat, and certainly a reason to read the book. I want to end with, we had spoken briefly before about the question of form, and I'm really interested in this, in part because I'm reading Ulysses, which is, of course, the greatest meditation on the Odyssey. It has been said, I think, well, it's certainly been said of climate change and the Anthropocene, and I feel similarly about migration and kind of crises of migration is, and this is, I think, you know, I'm not the only person asking this question, but does the kind of traditional book or the novel as a form, can it contain the multitudinous expanse of these new stories? And there are kind of two things I want to say about your book. Then I want to read a really brief paragraph about Ulysses, and then ask you the question, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So the first reason I thought about this is because at about kind of 3/4 of the way in, you do this. I don't know if you guys can see that, the sign. Can you see the kind of like change in the, no, well, you have to buy the book. No, it's on page 286, and basically you just, change the direction of the words, and it's a sign called Hotel City Plaza, and you're just, I think, trying to show us visually like what it looks like, yes. Right?
Yeah, that's how the sign was. The sign was a vertical
sure.
sign outside, so that's what it would look like.
Yeah, and I imagine this isn't the only moment when you found yourself possibly frustrated by paragraphs and traditional sentences and traditional kind of English language.
I think I in the beginning, I probably approached the book with a lot more formalist ambition, you know, and my editor kind of winced when I started, you know, talking about gravity's rainbow or something like that. And at the end, I realized a lot of this stuff was just not necessary. And the book is, I think, I try to write it in a fairly traditional way, in a narrative that I think a lot of people will just enjoy as a simple story with characters. And then if there are things that happen with form, which I've tried to do, they're happening at a more meta level.
And the second kind of moment that made me think about this is towards the end, Omar discovers Facebook.
Yes.
Or maybe he's had Facebook. He's spending a lot of time on Facebook. You're trying to write a compelling book about Omar.
Yes. And
he's in bed scrolling on Facebook for 6 hours a day. And so you basically say to yourself, what kind of protagonist was he?
Yeah, I'm frustrated. I'm like, Omar, you should be out there marching in these, you know, demonstrations with the Greeks. Yeah, with the Greeks, and you know, that would make for much better scenes for my book. And it's a moment where we've kind of reached a safe place, at least physically safe. So I think some of the tensions between us actually were surfaced a little more. And I did want to gesture to this kind of doubled consciousness that you are going to have necessarily as someone who undertakes this kind of journey with the intent of writing about it.
So please give me some more anecdotes, Omar.
yeah, material.
Sure. Yeah, more material. I'm not reading this to suggest that you are the 21st century James Joyce, although you know, it's
implied by the form of your
implied by the form of the question. But I've just been thinking a lot about this because it is the 100th anniversary of Ulysses, and we are pushing up, I think, again, with the kind of frustrations of form. So, and as Joyce was 100 years ago, and so he, you know, tries to find new ways of depicting the revolutions that are happening in his time. And I think we're trying to find ways for that, whether it's through migration, whether it's through the climate crisis. And so I just wanted to read this. This is from Kyberd, who's a great Joycean scholar's introduction to Ulysses. So he writes of Joyce, and I think you're doing this in the book. Those meditations addressed a central problem of modern writing, which is to say early 20th century writing, the breakdown of the old equation between the structure of a language and the structure of a known world. In simple terms, the zones of scientific and technical knowledge had expanded massively in the modern period, while the resources of language seemed to lag behind. Such developments as the analytic exploration of the conscious and unconscious had been confronted only belatedly by the makers of literature, and Joyce was one of the first to face the challenge. Matthieu, I think you, in your way in this book, are beginning to face the challenge of how to write about such an enormous phenomenon, and I think it is really a fantastic achievement. So thank you so much for sharing your experience with us this evening at the library.
Thank you, it's my pleasure.
Can we have a big round of applause? Are there any questions from the audience?
Hi, I'm curious what you make of the kind of marked difference between the way that Ukrainian refugees have been welcomed in recent weeks versus, as you kind of note, the ways in which public opinion in Europe sort of soured quite quickly on Afghan refugees.
Well, I think, you know, one interesting difference besides the obvious one of race and religion, which plenty of people pointed out, is that we actually have much less responsibility for the situation in Ukraine than the disaster in Afghanistan. And perhaps it's easier to feel sympathy for people when you don't have any guilt. Another thing that I think is interesting is the way the situation of Ukrainians shows how much these migration crises are caused not only by wars or other disasters, but also by a system of borders and laws. So I think one of the reasons why there are so many Ukrainian refugees, more than 4 million now, is because they're allowed to leave their country. They're allowed to come to the European Union without visas. They can drive their car to Poland. They don't have to resort to smugglers in order to cross the mountains and forests or risk their lives in little boats. And that is, of course, a situation that Afghans and Syrians face. And so their crisis, their suffering is not only the product of a war, but also of a system of borders, of laws, of visas that is designed to keep people from the developing world out of the rich world. And that's the global south is the context for the barriers that they encounter just trying to get out of their country. If you're Afghan, Afghans have the worst passport in the world when it comes to visa-free travel, and that's a direct consequence of them being likely to demand asylum, get asylum where they go. So if you're Afghan, you can't leave your country without visa, and you need a passport, which are very difficult to get. So from the very beginning, you're going to have to commit an illegal act and leave your country.
Hi. So I think this was around 5 years of reporting, if I'm not mistaken. So you're working with mounds of material and documents. Can you talk us through what the writing process was like for you and how you synthesized it into this book?
I wrote it over and over and over again. I think I probably went through 5 whole drafts, like head to tail. And the first one it wasn't even a properly structured draft, but it was around 160,000 words of material. And the book eventually came out at 90,000. So it was a process of just, I mean, it was my first book. I was trying to do things a little bit differently. I didn't have a clear model of what I was trying to write. And so it was really lost in the woods for long periods. I think it's why it took me so long, is it's not that complex of a book in many ways. I think it's fairly short and unadorned. But I was just struggling with huge amounts of material, and the only way I could really do that was to repeatedly just rewrite it over and over again, each time kind of stopping to do research, and yeah, it was a long process.
Yes.
Hi. I am curious, maybe this is drawing a little bit on the earlier question about the comparisons between Ukraine and Afghanistan, but I'm curious why you think it is that the war in Afghanistan has had such a little impact on the American popular imagination compared to other previous wars like Vietnam, sorry, that where it seems to me, and maybe you disagree, there's a more lasting impact on how Americans see themselves in the world.
Well, I think you're right, but I think the jury is also still out, because, I was just thinking in terms of war films, right? You kind of had for Vietnam War films, you had the Green Beret phase, John Wayne. Those are the films that came out during the war and immediately afterward. And it wasn't until a decade later that you had films like Apocalypse Now or Full Metal Jacket. And I think similarly with some of the books that were written about the war, A Bright Shining Lie, that like amazing book by Neil Sheehan, that's also very complex formally, probably one of the best books written about Vietnam, that came out in the 80s. So perhaps the books about the war that will really affect our consciousness of it are yet to come, or perhaps we're just way more distracted by Instagram and Facebook. I don't know.
We have a comment/question on Zoom. This is from Sarah Vaughan. She writes, in 2015, I worked with Syrian and Afghan refugees in Athens, settled in a disused school building where they cooperated on cooking. The Syrians dreamed of returning to their country in peaceful times, were often middle class and could foresee surviving in Europe. The Afghans, by contrast, spoke fewer foreign languages, were emotionally desperate just to survive with lesser vision for their immediate future. Does this relate to your experience?
Yeah, definitely. It was interesting to see the different ways that that class intersected with migration experiences. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world. The level of education is very low compared to a country like Syria, which was a middle income country where people were likely to be literate, educated, and that made a big difference when it came, especially to interacting with the asylum system, which requires people to tell a certain kind of story about themselves. A story of themselves as a deserving refugee, someone who's fled their country for the right reasons. One of the reasons of persecution on an individual basis, which, as I discuss in the book, is related to the particular Cold War history of the 1951 Geneva Convention, where the U.S. and its allies essentially wanted a definition of a refugee that would be tailored to communist dissidents. And so the Geneva Convention doesn't cover people who are just escaping war, actually. Subsequently, there have been other, human rights laws that cover people in Europe for that sort of thing. But anyhow, so I think people like Syrians, or just an Afghan who was educated and had more resources, had a much easier time telling the right story, even if they weren't necessarily, from a different situation. So yeah, I think there was a definite intersection of class with the experience.
Thanks a lot. You were saying that one of the reasons you wanted to undertake the journey was to try and draw a line under a period of reporting in Afghanistan, but then obviously history has dragged you back. And I was just wondering how the experience of the journey and trying to write the book, eventually writing the book, has changed the reporting in the period afterwards, if it's changed your experience of reporting afterwards.
Yeah, as you correctly point out, I went back to Afghanistan. I finished the book at the beginning of last summer, more or less, and I thought, I'll go back. I'd only been in Afghanistan once in that 5-year period that I took off to write the book. So in June, I went back, I got vaccinated, went back to Afghanistan. I thought, oh, well, I need to, get back into writing some stories, doing some journalism, not knowing like everyone else that the end was so near. And within a couple of months, the Taliban were at the gates of Kabul. I was able to stay, and I stayed there with some other colleagues to report on what came next. And of course, we witnessed pretty extreme situations of thousands of desperate people besieging the airport, suicide bombing that killed almost more than 100 people. The drone strike, by the U.S. that wiped out an innocent family. A whole new wave of Afghans fleeing their country, and so I was definitely drawn in. I spent 5 months there. I think what changed it for me possibly was that, a lot of this trip was kind of coming to terms with how I related to the work I was doing as a human being. I think for a long time, you just bracket that stuff out as a reporter and think, your job here is to observe and keep a distance. And then that became impossible on this trip. And I really, at the end, just kind of committed to helping my friend and his family reach their destination. And so I think I was possibly less conflicted about some of the things that we had to do during the evacuation, where, we were, because there were so few reporters on the ground, I was asked to help a convoy of buses get to the airport and essentially run the gauntlet of Taliban checkpoints and go in through the CIA paramilitary, Afghan paramilitary units gates, and to get these people out. And we all did it. I mean, not just me, but we all did it as kind of a matter of course. But I think I felt much less conflicted about that than I might have been before this trip.
We have time for one more question. There is one. Yes.
What you just described, it seems pretty dramatic, and it seems like some maybe like lasting trauma could come from experiencing that. I guess, have you felt that, and how do you deal with it if you do?
I think, yeah, definitely what you experience, and when you experience these kind of things, it has an effect on you. I think I have been probably fortunate in having a temperament that's able to tolerate more of this stuff. Or maybe the emotional recording apparatus is just completely gone, so there's no problems. But I don't think so. No, I have been.
Just had it removed.
I mean, I've been very lucky to have extremely supportive family. My parents might even be watching this right now, so hi, mom and dad, thank you. And family, friends who've helped me, been very patient with me. And so it is kind of a process, especially when you do this as when you go as a young freelancer, you really have no idea about this kind of stuff. I think we're more conscious of it now for sure. But when I went 13 years ago now, there wasn't much talk about PTSD and stuff like that. Certainly not for reporters. So, it's not too late to learn some new tricks, and I'm trying to learn to take more care of myself, and yeah, it's something I have tried to think about more.
Can we have a big final round of applause, please, for Matthieu? Thank you.
Thank you so much.